For decades, UFO researchers have claimed that these strange craft have some sort of affinity with active volcanoes. Well, not always active, but volcanoes nonetheless. Craft that seem to have the ability to ignore the volcanic plumes of these violent mountains when they're in the middle of an eruption, and craft that sometimes seem to be heading to the craters of these mountains, both of which should be absolutely impossible for a mundane object, whether that be a bird or an aircraft or something else. And in addition to that, sometimes laser beams are filmed operating in the midst of volcanic eruptions, which is a very strange thing as well. But all of these sightings and all of this footage theoretically could be subject to misidentification or camera trickery and hoaxes. However, recently a case was reported to AARO, to the organization with the Pentagon responsible for analyzing military UFO sightings, that an object was spotted flying through the plume of an active volcano, Mount Etna. And this footage went on for quite some time. And according to the analyst, the object was traveling far too fast to be a balloon or a bird or some sort of ordinary mundane object. And if it were an aircraft, well, it shouldn't have been able to ignore the plume of an active volcano. AARO carried out an analysis of this case, came to the conclusion that it was indeed a mundane object, unsurprisingly so. But interestingly enough, several of the independent research groups that AARO employs to do their analysis for them had very different conclusions, as did the professional drone operator who reported the case in the first place. And AARO was kind enough to provide their findings as well. And it was radically different from what AARO thought. At least two of these independent research groups concluded that the object did indeed pass through the volcanic plume, and one of them concluded that the object was traveling at hypersonic velocities. Okay, so AARO's assessment was that the object was actually moving at about 39 kilometers per hour or 24 miles per hour, moving west to east, consistent with wind speed and direction. The object's apparent high speed is attributable to motion parallax. They talk a lot about this. This is like their go-to explanation for just about every UAP sighting. Motion parallax is an optical effect that induces an observer to perceive that a stationary or slow-moving object is moving much faster than its actual speed when viewed from a moving frame of reference. The more quickly an observer moves relative to an observed object, the more pronounced this effect is. The UAS platform's relative motion made the object appear to move at high speeds. Now, how is that possible if the object was so far away? The relative speed of the UAS should not have had that big of an impact on the object's motion. But here's the reason. It's because AARO estimated that the object's distance from the UAS platform by comparing its speed, the cloud deck's apparent motion, and the wind speed to plot its trajectory. In other words, they were using the wind speed as sort of a biased detail to determine the actual distance that was involved. AARO applied comprehensive full motion video analysis, 3D modeling, pixel examination, and wind speed calculations to assess that the object was much closer to the drone than initially reported. The object did not pass through the volcano's ash plume. The object was approximately 170 kilometers away from the plume during the recording. In other words, this thing was far closer to the drone than the drone operator thought, and as you're going to find out later, much, much closer than a couple of the independent analysts thought that the object was from the drone as well. So their overall conclusion was that the object was only 30 kilometers away from the sensor. And here's a diagram of the actual flight path of the object versus the location of the volcano. A radical difference, a huge mistake that was made in distance estimation from this trained drone operator, but once again, maybe so. Arrow employed pixel examination also to conclude with moderate confidence that the object was spherical, probably a balloon. That's a go-to explanation, with an approximate diameter of 0.3 meters or 1 foot, a perfect size for a balloon. Due to the object's size and performance characteristics, Arrow assesses with moderate confidence that it is a balloon, but once again, high confidence according to what they had to say, that it wasn't demonstrating any sort of anomalous flight characteristics and it didn't fly through the plume at all. Arrow also includes some details about the sensor being employed. These sensors do not employ active range finding, and obtaining the accurate range to a target is highly dependent on environmental factors. The thermally turbulent atmospheric conditions near an actively erupting volcano likely disrupted the sensor's ability to capture accurate data. Volcanic ash, composed of fine particulates, scatters and absorbs infrared radiation in unpredictable ways, creating a noisy thermal environment. These conditions further reduce the sensor's accuracy by distorting the object's signature. The UAS platform's camera was optimized for air-to-ground observation rather than air-to-air detection. In this configuration, these sensors cannot detect and track airborne objects reliably and cannot provide an accurate range to the object. Airborne objects recorded by sensors configured in this way often appear indistinct, blurry, and featureless, even if they would have visually observable surface features under different collection conditions. Here's my problem with that assessment. We're talking about atmospheric conditions and ash and so on that existed in the vicinity of the volcano, and yet Arrow just said that this object had to be hundreds of kilometers away from the volcano when it was being observed. There should have been no atmospheric effects between the sensor and the object in flight to have created the phenomena that they're talking about. If the object was indeed that close, there shouldn't have been any atmospheric effects to confuse the drone operator. And there are other problems with their assessment as well, which I'm going to deal with in a moment once we have a look at the alternative analyses provided by other Arrow partners. All right, so alternative hypotheses. Once again, I was surprised to even see these. First of all, anomalous performance characteristics. An Arrow partner's initial assessment suggested the object may have moved up to 5,470 kilometers per hour or 3,400 miles per hour, about Mach 5, and that it transited the volcano's ash plume. Arrow and its other partners do not concur with these findings. Arrow's pixel examination analysis determined that the object was much nearer to the sensor than initial estimates, exacerbating the effects of motion parallax and leading to an incorrect assessment of the object's speed. Again, I can't imagine that this partner was so unprofessional as to make such an amateurish mistake, and I just wonder what they based that finding on. But once again, if we're talking about an object that can move at hypersonic speeds and blast right through volcanic plumes without a problem, it's really amazing that they came to this kind of conclusion. And again, these are professionals, not UFO enthusiasts, but they weren't the only ones. An Arrow partner compared the luminosity of the object's pixels to those around it and assessed that the object's gradient luminosity remained constant before, during, and after it appeared to transit the plume. This conclusion would place the object within the volcano's ash plume. So those are two independent groups of analysts that came to the same conclusion about the plume. Arrow and its other partners, I wonder how many partners there actually are, do not concur with these findings because the UAS platform sensor cannot provide accurate range finding data given the atmospheric turbulence. Arrow produced a validated 3D model demonstrating that the partner's assessment depends on unreliable and inaccurate input data. Oh, really? So their data is unreliable and inaccurate, but for some reason they came to the conclusion anyway. I can't imagine that professional organizations and professional analysts would rely on unreliable and inaccurate input data, but nevertheless, maybe they did. That being the case, though, there are some things that I've already discussed about this footage that kind of put Arrow's analysis into question. Number one, all of the turbulence and ash and other atmospheric effects that they claim the volcano would have on this footage should have no impact whatsoever on this object if it were as close as Arrow claimed. But here's the other problem. At a couple of points during this footage, especially at the end, the object just disappears, presumably disappearing into the volcanic plume and the surrounding cloud deck. There are no clouds close enough to the drone for this object to disappear into if it were that close. How did the drone operator lose track of this object if it were as close as Arrow claims it was? There are big inconsistencies with Arrow's analysis that, in my opinion, are every bit as problematic as the issues that the other analysts supposedly had. If this object were as close as Arrow claims, how did the drone operator lose track of it? Where did it go? There were no clouds, as near as we could tell, in between the drone operator and the cloud deck and volcanic plume around Mount Etna. Nothing that should have been able to swallow this object up as completely as it appeared to be. In my opinion, this remains one of the most fascinating UFO cases that the military has ever reported.